good evening, and thank you for joining us here on the Win TV News Extra. With me this evening, is Glenn Beeden, railway enthusiast. And one of the things that we're going to be doing today is looking at the history of railways in Trinidad and Tobago. It's a special treat, and an ironic one at that, wouldn't you agree, Glenn? Because we're now looking at reintroducing railways once again.
Well, I think that's a fantastic thing. You know, for many years, I always thought that it was kind of sad that the railways ended, but of course, with the mounting losses and the increase in road transport, this was something that was going to be inevitable. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's quite a treat for me to be back in Trinidad and to know that sooner or later we may see trains rolling across the horizon again, which will be very good.
Now, what has brought you back to Trinidad specifically with regard to the railways here? Well,
actually, the Trinidad Railways has been something that I've been interested in all my life. Mm-hmm. My mother took a picture of me in 1962, which I still have, sitting on top of my father's yacht in San Fernando docks, looking at the trains going by. And from that day on, actually, I would say that railways has been with me all my life. I've always really loved railways, and especially the Trinidad Government Railway. Yeah, I've got memories of seeing the trains going by, and you know, it's been somewhat of a nostalgic thing for me. Over the years, there's never been anything published or anything out there that really gives you a complete history of the Trinidad Government Railway, or any railways for that matter in Trinidad.
Really?
So I've seen bits and pieces of information. I've spoken to people, but to say there's a comprehensive book just on the railways of Trinidad, there is nothing like that today. So I guess over the years, you know, I've always wanted to have a book, but none was out there. So yeah, I figured that maybe one day I would write a book, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do, pull all the information together.
So you're up to the challenge of amalgamating all of this information.
Exactly.
Many people think that railways started much later in Trinidad and Tobago and ended much earlier in Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the things that you enlightened me about is it actually started in 1839.
Yes, that's very interesting because there's a bit of confusion over that date. Now, 1839, a Scottish planter by the name of William Eccles laid a track from San Fernando to Princestown, well, actually to St. Madeleine to begin with, along the Cipero River, which became known as the Cipero Tramway. Now, the initial track was laid in 1839, I believe, but you know, that's something I'm still trying to research. I've seen reports of it being 1850. I've seen reports of it being 1860. Now, the Cipero Tramway, it really pulled cane and eventually pulled passengers, but I think the Cipero Tramway really became well known when it brought the first steam locomotive, right? The first steam locomotive was Forerunner, and it arrived at the Deepwater Harbor in Port of Spain and was transshipped to San Fernando. And from San Fernando in 1864, was the date that it first started working in the South, right? So you really could say that steam locomotives began in 1864. That's the first steam locomotive. You have to remember that the Trinidad Government Railway didn't start laying tracks from South Key to Arima until 1876. That's when it was opened, right? In fact, 1870 was when they first started laying tracks.
Yes.
Now, many people out there think that the Trinidad Government Railway ended, well, it did in 1968, but they believe that was the end of rail transport in Trinidad. But actually, that's not entirely true. The last rails, or the last standard gauge trains that ran in Trinidad ran in 1998, yes. So, you know, this was using St. Madeleine. So that's a whole 30 years later.
Primarily for the use of transport.
Well, it was all sugar by then, yeah. But the other thing to remember is that part of what used to be the Trinidad Government Railway, the line that ran from San Fernando to Cipero, right? Part of that line was used by the Using St. Madeleine or by Caroli Limited. So, you know, in 20 years ago, that's where I spent a lot of time filming trains, because that stretch was the old Trinidad Government Railway. Now, in going down there and filming the trains along that stretch, I became interested in Caroni trains as well. So it's been something that I've been doing for quite a long time now.
What's the difference between the Caroni trains and the government trains?
Well, there wasn't much of a difference. The track was all standard gauge track, 4 foot 8.5, right, is the standard gauge track. And the sugar company laid their railways to that track gauge, so that they didn't have to transship the loads. They could just basically run the carriages and the trains from one system to the next without having to change the gauge, right? The railways in Trinidad, you know, the sugar railways were quite some substantial systems, okay? you had the Brecon Castle or the northern area system of Caroni, which at one time was 130 miles of track. Okay?
Really?
The southern area, it ended up being 20 miles of track, 22 miles of track, but at one time there were probably 60 miles of track.
Were they interconnected?
They were through the TGR, the Trinidad Government Railway, right?
Okay.
And in fact, the trains would run along the TGR after the passage of the last passenger train in the evening. Okay? So at one time, both of those northern and southern area were linked by rail. After 1976, well, in fact, after 1968, no more passing from one to the next happened because Trinidad Government Railway ended. But the northern area of Caroni continued with rail transport up until 1976. And then, of course, with the new highway going in and, it was just too difficult.
Took its toll.
Exactly, and it was very difficult for them to cross the new highways. In fact, I remember coming back to Trinidad in late 1970 and seeing a train going across what was then the Princess Margaret Highway. I'm thinking, my goodness, it's still running, but that was the end, right? I mean, 1976, they shut it down. However, using St. Madeleine, which had a greater degree of farmers' cane rather than company cane, right? The other thing about using St. Madeleine was that there were some higher grades. In other words, the gradients were stronger, right? So using St. Madeleine was always the place that had the bigger engines, okay? And, using St. Madeleine continued with rail transport until 1998. In fact, I went down there a couple of days after it was announced that they were closing, and I went into the sheds and filmed, spoke to the guys, took photographs and that sort of thing. So I have that archive as well, So I tried to keep a historical perspective on what was going on, because nobody else seemed to be quite interested at all in trains.
What was going on? Apart from the introduction of highways,
yes,
which essentially meant the progress of vehicles running back and forth and transport becoming more mass applicable to the population, how expensive was it really to run the trains when they initially started, and how expensive did it eventually become, if that may have been a factor in their closing?
I think it was a factor in so much as, remember that the tonnage of sugar that was pulled, in the early days was a lot more, and of course the price of sugar collapsed, right? The price of sugar was up there. It was economical. But I think as time progressed, they started pulling, the maintenance of these lines and the maintenance of the trains were beginning to take their toll. They just were not economical. And in fact, you can well understand why they closed many of those lines. The exact reason why St. Madeleine kept their trains longer, I think, was because of the fact that it all came from cane farmers, and it was the cane was harvested in areas that were less accessible than they were in the north. The north, a lot more roads put in, and a lot more population around the area, so there was a better infrastructure, as it were, right? The south continued longer with rail, I think, because of that. But to be honest, if you really look at it in detail, you'll see that what they call the Tasker trucks. You must have heard of the term Tasker truck,
yes,
right? The Tasker trucks started taking over more and more of the rail toward the end. And in fact, toward the end, the only thing that really ran was the Valley line, which went down to Barrapaw. They would haul the cane in that way. But then, to that in 1998 succumbed, and they changed it.
And no matter how long it takes, and no matter for goodness sakes, you'll be gone. You'll be gone. You'll be gone. You'll be gone.